Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there, and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. After we finished last week's show with Arthur Milnes, we continued our chat, specifically some great stories about his interaction with prime ministers, a U.S. president, and a lot of tree planting in his backyard. Here's part 2 of that conversation. So Arthur, welcome back to the program.
It's been a long time, hasn't it?
I know. And I guess we'll begin by getting you to give us a little bit of background as to how you got all that help with the gardening in your back and front yard.
Well, basically I learned a long time ago in my life that you never know what you'll get until you ask. And since I was a kid, my interest has been prime ministers of Canada and U.S. presidents. So when I was young in high school, if a political issue concerned me, I would write a letter. And as a young man, you have to give full credit to Canada's political leaders in the 1980s. I once wrote to Pt.2 about some concern, and he phoned me, which
Really?
is pretty heady stuff when you're 17. And I still remember we were having dinner at my parents' house, and the phone rang, and I jumped up and grabbed it. And all of a sudden, I started saying, yes, sir, no, sir, and all this, and yes, sir. And I got off the phone, and my mother said, who was that? And I said, oh, it was Pt.2 calling. He wants me to have coffee with him in Montreal next week. And my mother looked at me. I can see her eyes. She's been passed for a long time. I can still see it like yesterday. She looked at me. We were still eating dinner, and she said, we have to get you a suit. And she took me right over to Cedarbrae Mall in Scarborough and bought me a suit at Tip Top Tailors. So that's what I wore when I walked into Pt.2's office. He gave me about an hour of his time, which is pretty incredible for a 17-year-old, and fully to Mr. Trudeau's credit. And in the same period, Brian Mulroney, I got to meet with him, John Turner, Ed Broadbent, you name it. And I always tell young people today that, particularly in an age where everybody sends emails, write a snail mail letter, because they're so rare now they get through, right? And when I worked for Brian Mulroney on his memoirs, when my friends found out, quite often school kids study Prime Minister of Canada in the grade 5 unit. And I had 4 or 5 times where parents would come to me and say, hey, Art, my son's doing a project on Brian Mulroney. Any way you could help? And sure enough, all over Kingston, 4 or 5 times, kids would get phone calls from the 18th Prime Minister at home, and he would help them with their projects.
Do you have a sense as to why Pierre Trudeau gave you a call after receiving that letter? What was it in the letter that sort of got him interested in talking to you?
I don't know exactly, except that this was the mid-'80s, and I was a young person very, very concerned about the Cold War and the possibility of nuclear war. And I wrote to him. I wrote to him quite passionately. I can't find the letter. The National Archives a year or so ago, they went into his papers and they found 5 or 6 other letters I had sent to him, but not that one. So again, totally to Mr. Trudeau's credit, because things like that for a young person are life-changing, and it sure had a profound impact on me.
So writing for you is something that goes way back.
Oh, yeah. My first letter I wrote to the Queen when I was in grade 3. I watched a documentary with my parents down in the basement in Scarborough one night, and they were talking about the Humane Society in London, England, putting to sleep all these stray dogs. And I became furious, and my father, just casually probably, though I took it as a huge order from Dad, he said, oh, well, why don't you write the Queen? So I did. And a few weeks later, I got this big package back from Buckingham Palace. So full credit to Her Majesty as well.
Jeez. Okay, let's go into your backyard. The idea of planting trees came from where?
My guess is, I honestly don't know, Dave. Well, my guess is, being a political history junkie, again, starting when I was very young, I remember reading about John F. Kennedy planting a tree at Rideau Hall in Ottawa while on a state visit to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, for whatever reason, I found that very interesting. And I read more about it, and apparently all distinguished visitors to the Governor General's residence are invited to plant a tree. So I think that, cliche, I think that planted an idea in my head.
Now, the business of planting trees in your backyard started in 2006, I believe, with John Turner?
Oh, yes. And Mr. Turner was my first. I've been had the privilege to know Mr. Turner for many, many years as a reporter. And when I was working at the Whig Standard, Mr. Turner, I found out a friend of mine spotted him at Kingston's Via station, hailing down a cab. And I was angry about that because in the world I come from, I don't want to sound arrogant, but if former prime ministers come to my city, they don't hail cabs. I go pick them up. So I found out that Mr. Turner came to Kingston once a year for board meetings at Empire Life. So I waited a year and I phoned him and I said, Mr. Turner, I hear you're coming to Kingston next week. He said, yes, I am. And I said, well, how about I pick you up? And then we'll go to a bar and have a drink or something like that. And he said, sure. So I went out, and a friend of mine worked at a local car rental place. I told him what I was doing. So they gave me for free this massive, massive red convertible. So with that, I went off to pick up the 17th Prime Minister of Canada, a Liberal, and we got out to the car, and Mr. Turner admired it, and then he said, Arthur Milnes, he said, you're not still working at the Whig Standard if you can afford this thing. So then I put him in my car, and we went driving through the streets of Kingston. It was a very cool experience, and he made a lot of requests about, he would say, turn right here. And we would go past the prison, and he would tell me stories about his work as Solicitor General with Kingston Penitentiary. And then we go by Queens, and he talked about the Kingston Conference of the Liberal Party in 1960. And anyway, to make a long story short, so then we went to a restaurant and just sat, and he told me war stories for a couple of hours. And it was just an incredible experience for me. And so after that, probably 2 years later, I was, it now became an annual thing. And Mr. Turner would actually phone me and say, I'm coming to town Tuesday, right? And off I would go and get him. And then one day, I was going to see Mr. Turner to pick him up at Via. It was probably 2 days before. And I said to my wife, I said, Alison, I have a crazy idea. And she says, what's that? And I told her about the trees at Rideau Hall. And I said, what if I asked Mr. Turner to plant a tree in our garden? And Alison laughed, probably not thinking I would follow through. So anyway, to make a long story short, I went to a local company that produces plaques. And I had a plaque made up. And I can still quote it because all of my trees say the exact same thing. This tree was planted by the Right Honorable John N. Turner, 17th Prime Minister of Canada, and the date. But he hadn't agreed yet. So I went to pick him up, and we were driving along, and I said, sir, I have a crazy request for you. And he said, what's that, Arthur? I said, instead of going to a restaurant, why don't we go to my house? I've got a bottle of scotch for us, and I want you to plant a tree in my garden. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, I want you to plant a tree. And he looked at me and he said, let's do it. So I decided then and there that I would try to get every living Prime Minister of Canada to come to my house and plant a tree.
Do you remember what kind of tree it was?
Mr. Turner's, yes.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it now. It's a smoke tree. And boy, does it like the spot I chose, or it's a liberal and loves John Turner. And it has been growing and growing, and it's one of the highlights of my garden. Every year I send a picture to all the prime ministers to show them how their trees are doing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's cool. So how did you get the next person to agree to come over to your house? Did you use John Turner as the example?
Yes. The next person was 3 or 4 years later. I read in the paper that Paul Martin was coming to Kingston to receive an honorary degree. So I phoned him, and I didn't know Mr. Martin that well, but I knew him. Mr. Martin, he came on the phone, and I said, "Sir, when you're in Kingston, next month, would you mind coming over to my house and planting a tree?" And I said, "John Turner has himself already planted a tree." So without hesitation, Mr. Martin said, "Boy, that would be fun." And he gave me permission to invite all my neighbors. And my wife Allison's a grade 5 teacher. So she put the word out to her school kids and their families. And after the ceremony at Queen's, Mr. Martin came to my house. And the special part was that I got the Fort Henry Guard to send an honor guard. So everybody was in the garden, and when Mr. Martin arrived, he was marched in by the Fort Henry Guard. And my favorite part of that was before he came over to where his tree was to be planted, the honor guard and he all stopped at John Turner's tree and saluted Mr. Turner's tree. So it was a wonderful day. All of our neighbors got to meet the former prime minister, and all the kids got to have their pictures taken. It was just a wonderful event. And again, totally to the credit of Mr. Martin. But Mr. Martin's interesting as well, because he has actually been back to visit his tree 3 times since. And we always go take a picture to see his tree's progress. And he's quite a wonderful man. And like me, he really loves history. And to go back to my letter writing, when I was younger, when I was a Queen's student, I obviously took politics and history. And there were a few times where I had Canadian politics essays. And I would write letters to the only living man who had served in 4 prime ministers' cabinets, which was Paul Martin's father. And Mr. Martin would write me these lengthy responses. And again, that's pretty heavy stuff when you're in first year or second year university, to be able to put in your footnotes, personal communication with the Honorable Paul Martin. Mm-hmm. So I have always felt a special kinship with the Martin family.
I have to get you to tell us how you became associated with Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind, and how they came to stay in your house overnight when he was in town receiving an honorary, or both of them actually received honorary degrees from Queen's. Tell us that story.
Well, again, it starts in high school. And for whatever reason, out of the blue, I bought Jimmy Carter's memoirs, Keeping Faith. And for whatever reason, it left me with this fascination with President Carter. And in my parents' house, my mother never spoke about politics, with one exception. And when he was president, my mother would always say, she said it many times, that Jimmy Carter was a good and decent man. And my father as well, they both felt that with the Cold War going on, that to have a decent, honest man like Jimmy Carter to have his finger on the West's nuclear button, they felt safe. So that left me with this interest, and I would write to President Carter when I was young, and I would get handwritten letters back. It was quite incredible. And then finally, about 20 years ago, I started to go once a year to Plains, Georgia, where he lives, a little isolated town in southwestern Georgia. And he always gave me interviews. And I would always only interview him about Canadian concerns and his memories of his work with Joe Clark and Pierre Trudeau. So I guess we kind of hit it off. And eventually I was doing political history research for Tom Axworthy at Queen's University. So we created a series of books, and I was quite honored. I prepared a book called Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, A Canadian Tribute. And President Carter honored us by, he wrote the foreword. And then President Carter took it a step further, and he phoned me one day here in Kingston, and he said, Arthur, if you'd like to have your book launch at the Jimmy Carter Historic Site, Rosalind and I would be honored to host you. So about 100 of us went down to Plains, and as a result of my book, the Principal of Queens wanted to award President and Mrs. Carter honorary degrees. So I played a modest role in that. And when the Carters accepted, I phoned President Carter and I said, sir, I assume you're sick of hotels. So when you're here in Kingston, why don't you and Mrs. Carter just stay with Allison and I, and there'll be no mucky mucks. There'll be nobody comes over to the house. It'll just be the four of us. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, thank God, because anybody in public life at that level is utterly sick of hotels.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because they live in them. And the other thing unique to it, because a lot of my friends would say, how the heck did you get Jimmy Carter to do this? Well, if you read about President and Mrs. Carter, when they ran for president in 75, 76, they had no money. So they would actually stay in people's homes. And their first large event at the White House, when President Carter won, they had a big reception for all the people who had hosted them in their homes. So it wasn't actually a strange thing for President and Mrs. Carter to do. And obviously, I knew I had to get a presidential and first lady tree planted. So I had lots of warning. So I contacted a local arborist. He landscaped it, and we had these 2 trees. Well, here's the special part. I always encourage my tree planters to bring soil, special soil.
Okay, yeah.
And President and Mrs. Carter brought a bucket of red Georgia clay. So that's how we planted the trees.
So I guess the question I would have, and I guess a lot of listeners would have too, is that when a president and his wife travel anywhere, even if it's a former president, there is always a retinue of Secret Service agents that accompany them. So how did that happen with respect to your house and the Secret Service?
I can't remember the amount of agents, but it was a lot of them. And they surrounded our house all day and night. When the president and Mrs. Carter arrived at the house, they blocked the street. And when they left the next day to go down to Queens, they blocked the street. It was very exciting. And I made a point of telling the Secret Service, because they sent an advance team to my home a couple of weeks before, that the Secret Service were welcome to perform their jobs. They were quite welcome to stay inside our house, whereas often they spend the night outside patrolling. Yeah. So they were quite appreciative. And then a nice little gesture, just before the President and Mrs. Carter went down to Queens, the lead agent asked the president if they could make a presentation to my wife and I. And they gave us the special Secret Service pins. And as another small tribute, which was wonderful, and not a tribute to us, a tribute to our country, every Secret Service agent wore a Canadian flag pin.
That was nice.
Yeah, very nice of them. They were a wonderful bunch. So when the Carters were here, the Carters stayed on our top floor. Then the Secret Service occupied the main floor of our house. And that night, Allison and I slept in the basement.
So what did you serve for breakfast?
You know what? I asked the Carters ahead of time, and it was very nothing fancy. Just Jimmy and Rosalind Carter have never forgotten where they came from. They're farmers, and it was fruit and bagels and a few things like that. Nothing special at all.
No peanut butter?
I can't remember. You know what? I probably did, because it was Jimmy Carter, of course.
That's right. Peanut farmer. Now,
it's one of those, one funny story is those moments in life where you regret not having a camera handy is We went down to the basement in the afternoon to have a fire. It was November, and to have a glass of wine. And I took the president into my basement, and I had a large Jimmy Carter bobblehead. And President Carter zeroed right in on it. And he picked it up and he said, "Arthur, this is me." And I didn't have a camera.
Now, you have had other people plant trees in your backyard, and it's been a cross-section of political leaders on both sides of the aisle here in Canada. And I'm curious because you are probably better known amongst a lot of people as a speechwriter for Stephen Harper, and you worked on the memoirs of Brian Mulroney, but you seem to be friends with people on both sides of the aisle. So would you consider yourself to be nonpartisan?
Yes, I have partisan beliefs, but in my work in history and in my previous work in journalism, for the most part, and there have been slip-ups, I keep my own politics out of things. I respect the office of Prime Minister, regardless of who's in it. I respect any single person who has had the courage and skill to get to that job. I think in my lifetime we've been incredibly well served. And I study a lot of Canadian prime ministerial history, and I don't want to make it too big of a thing about this, but in recent years, a lot of our universities have simply stopped studying prime ministers. So I'm a pretty rare bird. So I've been quite lucky. I've known and been trusted by all of our living prime ministers. I feel very special and lucky.
Now, one story here that I think we'll have to wrap up with is the business of all the trees are in the backyard, save one.
Yes. So John Chrétien, who I've known for years, he was coming to Kingston. So I phoned him and he phoned me back and he said, he calls me the history guy. And he said, "Hi, history guy." And I told him I wanted him to plant a tree. And he said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, I want you to plant a tree when you're in town next week." And he agreed. But then he said, "Who else has done it?" So I named off the three other prime ministers who had planted trees in my backyard. And Mr. Chrétien said, "I don't want to be around them. I want to be on your front lawn." As a result, his tree is by himself on the front lawn. And before we go, since I'm on the radio, I want your listeners, and I want you, Dave, to send out a reminder to Justin Trudeau that he is the only prime minister who hasn't planted a tree yet. We have his spot ready, and he has told me personally on 3 occasions that he will be coming over, and we're waiting.
Now, he's the only living prime minister that's not there yet, right?
Exactly. But he's told me, and Mark Garrettson as well has assured me, that before Mr. Trudeau leaves office, he'll be in my backyard doing his duty for Canada in planting a tree in this special garden.
The National Historic Site.
Yeah, I self-declared the house with all the powers invested in me. I put a plaque on the front of my house that says, "Here slept the 39th President of the United States," and then I give the dates. People, when they make deliveries or the mailman, they just think it's hilarious, right? And I've actually, one time I came home, and this is a true story, and I came into my backyard, and there was a family in my yard looking at my tree plaques. and a neighbor had told them, so they just came over. So it's like I've always said that if I get rich, and that hasn't happened yet, trust me, you don't get rich if you want to go into history studies in Canada.
No.
Someday I would hope that I would be able to leave the house to Queen's or RMC as sort of a study house for political science or history students. But like I said, I haven't gotten rich yet. So.
Well, listen, Arthur, we have reached the end of another program, and I certainly love the stories, and I do appreciate your time.
Well, as you learned last time, you get me talking about this stuff, you know the true meaning of history.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Arthur. All the best.
Thanks, Dave.
Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.